member of the Foggy Bottom West End Village Program Committee. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the first presentation in our Art Thursday series of art-related talks on Zoom. And today we're very fortunate to have Lorna Grenadier, a longtime National Portrait Gallery docent, and also a long-term, in fact, one of the founding members of the Foggy Bottom West End Village. And Lorna will be our guide in discussing the portraits of change. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Lorna and enjoy the presentation. Lorna, it's all yours.
Oops.
I can't hear her.
No.
Oh, there. Oh, welcome.
My thanks initially to both Jackie and Jonas for conceiving and producing this event. I've had an extraordinary amount of fun and pleasure doing it, and I'm glad to be able to share it with you all. I think one of the questions you might be asking, as I have asked myself, is why did I choose these two particular people to talk about? And the reason is I knew absolutely nothing about them, zero. So that intrigued me, got my curiosity going, and I've discovered they are such amazing people that I find them so fascinating and their lives so meaningful that by the time I've shared what I've learned with you at the end, I hope you will feel the same about them. So Jonas, if we could start the first slide. We'll begin with Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks was from Chicago, and she lived from 1917 to 2000. She died in 2000. She initially came from, she was born in Kansas, and then her parents moved to Chicago. But before we get to her life story, I thought we'd start off with the artwork. This is the bust of her that you see on the right side. It's just a head, it's in bronze. She's about 76 in this photograph. And she is situated in the picture the way she is in the museum. Behind her right, to the left side of the screen, is a very large oil painting of Betty Friedan. So when I look at these two pictures, it's as if the two women are in conversation. So as I tell you a little bit about the artist and how this work came to be, I invite you to just look at the bust of Miss Brooks and see what things strike you about it. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. So the occasion for the making of this bust was, it was commissioned by the Chicago Public Library. They wanted to honor famous authors from Chicago, and Gwendolyn Brooks is definitely one of them. Another one was Saul Bellow, Nobel laureate. The artist selected to carry out this commission was a woman named Sarah Miller. Sarah Miller was not an artist from her youth. She had a very successful real estate career and then decided in her 60s to take up sculpture. She took classes at the Chicago Institute of Art. She traveled to Italy and apprenticed there with a sculptor, and then came back to carry out these commissions. This was one of two busts. This one she did Saul Bellow, and I think she also did Ernest Hemingway. So when the Portrait Gallery saw these commissioned, they also asked the artist to make a cast of both Gwendolyn Brooks and Saul Bellow that came into the Portrait Gallery collection around the same time in 1994. So here we see Gwendolyn Brooks. She's mature, and you can see her hair is now natural. It was not always like that. So if we go to the second picture, here you see the very same bust and the one that Sarah Miller did of Saul Bellow. And can you see the the impact of not having lighting, not having the shading to highlight her particular features? So I think there is a benefit to actually seeing an artwork in where it's actually on exhibit. So if we go on to the, I did also want to say I wasn't able to find a lot of information about Sarah Miller's technique. The only thing that I could discover is that she rushed to Saul Bellow's apartment as he was getting ready to leave Chicago so she could measure his head. So it may be that she was trying to make these works life-size. So we can go on to the next slide, please, Jonas. So here is a 50-year-old or so, Gwendolyn Brooks, seated on a sofa with her elderly mother to her right. And her mother and both her father were extremely influential in Gwendolyn Brooks becoming a poet. Her mother had been a teacher, a classically trained pianist. Her father had ambitions to be a doctor, had started university at Fisk to do so, but circumstances changed. He had a young family. And so after Gwendolyn Brooks was born in Topeka, she was just a few weeks old when they emigrated, or migrated, I should say, part of the Great Migration right around the end of World War I to Chicago. It's interesting, Gwendolyn noted, to give you an idea of how her parents felt about reading and the arts, his wedding present to Kezia was a bookcase full of Harvard classics. So they were very interested in encouraging both Gwendolyn in her interest in poetry, as well as her younger brother Raymond, who came a year after they were very close. He was more of an artist and she was the writer. She was, personality-wise, she was very much a loner. She was introspective somewhat, but she wrote her first poem when she was 7 years old. And her first published poem was when she was 13. So by the time she finished high school, she had submitted many, many poems to the Black newspaper in Chicago called the Chicago Defender, which I believe is still published today. And she had at least 75 poems or verses, as you can see in this hand-colored, decorated binder on the left, where it has blue stripes and a red triangle. And it says by Gwendolyn Brooks, and it says published verses, The Defender. So, as I said, her family was very encouraging, but she had other people who influenced her. And if we go to the next slide, we can see who these people were. On the bottom right is a photograph of a woman named Charlemagne Rollins. And Charlemagne was a librarian in the Chicago Public Library. And she had sessions for children, she had workshops, she brought in speakers. She was very encouraging for decades in the Black community in Chicago. Above her and to her side, we see portraits of two men. Above her is a photograph of Langston Hughes, known as the Harlem Renaissance poet. And just in the painting, we see James Weldon Johnson. He was as much a lyricist as a poet, but his claim to fame is writing the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing, what became known as the Negro National Anthem. So Mrs. Brooks, Gwendolyn's mother, would take her to occasions to see these authors when they were in town, and she got to meet them in person and actually read some of her poetry. She corresponded with them and they encouraged her, saying she was quite talented. One day she would be published, but in the meantime, you should be writing every day and reading modern poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. On the top left, you see a group of people sitting around a table, different races, and there is a woman on the left wearing a hat, and that is Inez Stark. She was a very wealthy white woman in Chicago who was very involved with poetry. She was a reader for a poetry magazine, But here she is in the south side of Chicago. That is where the Brooks family lived. And she held poetry workshops, and the students and she would engage and talk about their work. So they were very much influential as well in recognizing Gwendolyn's talent. And if we go to the next slide, we'll get a sense of what kind of environment Gwendolyn Brooks lived in. On the right side, you see a little single family home with a white picket porch. And that was the home she lived in for 40 years, from the early 50s into the 90s. That's not where she did her writing as a young child, but it was a similar type of single family home. On the left side, we see her in the backyard, the back of the house, and you see these porches with steps going up to the top story. That is very much like the porch that Gwendolyn Brooks had when she was a little girl, and that was known as her writing space. Here we see her in this photograph. This was taken in 1960, so she's probably in her late 30s or 40s. So if we go to the next slide, we'll get a sense of what her life was like when she married. In the top left corner, you see her husband, Henry Blakely Jr. Then you see Gwendolyn Brooks with a beautiful hat and a lovely smile, and a little boy, their first child, Henry Blakely III. This is probably in the mid-40s. They married in the late 30s. They met at an NAACP Youth Council meeting. But I think what drew them together was their shared passion for poetry. In fact, Nora, Gwendolyn Brooks' daughter, was born in 1951, would say her mother would talk about her mother getting love sonnets from Henry, and she would write back giving him some little criticisms. So even after they were married, they very much shared this passion. He did publish, not as much as she, but he gave her advice and encouragement. So she very much relied on him. He was as much a friend and a co-author as he was her beloved husband. But when they married, this was a time when housing was very difficult to find, affordable housing. Again, the huge migration to the north. And so they moved into a tiny apartment that had been subdivided from a luxury building. It was an old building. And they were referred to as kitchenettes. And indeed, Gwendolyn Brooks wrote one of her poems, was called The Kitchenette. But you can see her here playing the piano, which is situated right by large windows looking out over the street and the traffic and the people. She was very musical, just like her mother. And I think if you look at her poetry, if you're not familiar with it, I think it has a musicality to it. But this is where she said, you know, I could look out the window and there was a poem. So she used the time in this apartment and others that they lived in to capture the life of the Black urban poor. By 1943, she had been recognized with the Poetry Award, the Midwestern Writers Conference. That caught the attention of a local publisher. They invited her to put together a book of Negro poems. Eventually, it was Harper and Row who published her first book in 1945 called A Street in Bronzeville. Bronzeville being the name that journalists ascribed to the Black community in Chicago. It was the place that sort of took over for the Harlem in terms of the Renaissance. The Black culture, the Chicago Renaissance in the 30s and 40s was in Bronzeville. And Gwendolyn Brooks talks about having all these parties at her home. They'd squeeze in dozens of people in the two-room space. But the first book was quite a good seller, and it got her national attention. She got Guggenheim Awards, a Mademoiselle Award, very good reviews. But there was someone who was probably instrumental in getting that book published, and that was another Chicago writer, Richard Wright, who wrote A Native Son. He was approached by the editor at Harper, should we publish these poems? And he made quite clear that this was quite a talented writer. And when we look at the picture at the top right corner, there is Gwendolyn Brooks, and she's seated at a typewriter. There are many books in bookcase behind her, and on the table is the next book that she wrote called Annie Allen. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that it was Annie Allen for which she received the Pulitzer Prize in 1950. That photograph we just saw actually was used in the newspaper to announce her having received the prize. But it was very much like the stories she told in A Street in Bronzeville, but she was not only the youngest person to receive a Pulitzer at that point, she was the first Black to do so. There had been none before her, since I think Pulitzers were created in 1917. So it was a life-changing moment for her. She laughingly said later in life, maybe she should have changed her name to Gwendolyn Pulitzer Brooks. But it was quite a distinction. The judges were unanimous in selecting her over all the others they considered. They thought her style was original. She had a unique voice. It was just heads and shoulders above the others that were under consideration. They had no hesitation about selecting this book. She said that she actually wrote poetry to satisfy herself, and she was eager to have her words both beautiful to read, but also good to listen to. So if we go to the next slide, we'll get a sense of some of the things that characterized her approach to poetry. Definitely, poetry is life distilled. She could say some of the most unusual things in just 2 or 3 words. She was able to capture life so succinctly. But she had a transformative moment in her career in 1967, after spending many, many years teaching in universities and going on lecture tours and readings. She stopped off at Fisk University in 1967. They were having a conference of young Black writers. And this awakened a consciousness in her identity as a person of color. And it changed her writing style. She was very much influenced by the assassination of Martin Luther King. She wrote a poem about that called Riot. There were other things happening, and she wanted to focus on racial identity and equality. As I said, her poetic techniques were masterful. She could do anything from free verse to quatrains, sonnets, ballads, enjambment. I mean, I never knew that was a word, but she was just very, very talented as a writer. And one thing else she did do to encourage Black writers is to support these new publishers coming out, the Black publishers. So she left Harper, had her work published by others, and ultimately she founded her own publishing company, and she named it after her beloved father. She thought he was the ideal father, so she called it the David Company. So Blackness is what I know best. I want to talk about it with definitive illustration. And writing is the only work in which I am interested. You know, she was still a housewife and had other domestic things that she had to do, but writing was her passion. So if we go on to the next slide, we can see here Gwendolyn Brooks seated at a table. She's been involved, she's as the Poet Laureate of Illinois, a position to which she was appointed in 1968. She was so enthusiastic about the role. She got no remuneration. And her goal was to establish poetry awards, things that didn't exist when she was a young girl going to various schools. And so she would fund special prizes. And she loved talking to people. And so there's a charming picture of a young girl, I can't tell her age, seated to her left with a big smile on her face. And on the other side of her, standing next to Miss Brooks, we see a couple of people very attentive as Miss Brooks is probably signing something. I mean, she was all in for her public. And this was, I think, what was so meaningful to her, to be able to share her passion for poetry with others. Part of being a poet laureate was that she could write poems for special occasions. And one of the special occasions was the unveiling of a Picasso public sculpture, but I think more meaningful to her, for the inauguration of the first Black mayor of Washington, of Chicago, Harold Washington. So I wanted to show you on the next slide, this is a poem for which she was most renowned, and it's taught in many school curricula. It's called The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. And I'll attempt to read it, but I can't do it in quite the way Miss Brooks could. This is what it says. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. These were young men that she had seen in a pool hall in her neighborhood. This is 1959. And she knew that they should have been in school, but rather than chastising them for not being there, she was curious about what they thought about themselves. And so here in fewer than 25 words, she's captured how they think, what they do, what gives their life meaning, and the fact that they think they're going to die soon, which is very tragic. And while this is, she said she wished people read more of her poetry, this poem had definite impact. She received a letter after having read it at a high school from a 16-year-old boy saying, you know, I thought I'd leave school, but after I heard that poem, I'm going to stay in school. So there was a real impact to her writing. And it wasn't just, children were important to her. And you'll see in the next slide that she actually wrote a children's book, Bronzeville Boys and Girls, dedicated to her son and daughter, whom she adored. In fact, when she asked what made her happiest, she said, well, I'll always say it's my children. She loved her children. And so she wrote a book of poetry for children in 1956. And on the 50th anniversary, it was reissued with a different cover and illustrations done by Faith Ringgold. The original illustrator was Ronnie Solbert. She had a Fulbright. She had done a lot of international travel. But what you cannot see if you're not seeing the slide is the young children in the original edition are white. I think we may see a couple of Black children in the back. But in the Faith Ringgold illustrations, all the illustrations are highlighting the Black children, Black community. Gwendolyn Brooks not only wrote children's books, she did write a novel, and she wrote a 2-part autobiography, which she called Report from Part 1 and Report from Part 2. And they're not very typical autobiographies, but they're a delight to read. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that here she is, Miss Brooks, with her daughter Nora, and they're at the White House. Gwendolyn Brooks had met many presidents before this particular event in 1994. She met JFK, John Kennedy in 1962, who'd invited her to participate in a poetry conference. She'd visited the White House when President Johnson was there. He was her hero. She'd also been invited to the White House by President Carter, and here again during the Clinton administration, when she received the very prestigious National Endowment for Humanities Award to present the Jefferson Lecture. And you can see her at the White House with her daughter looking at a portrait of Eleanor Roosevelt. This was done by an artist named Douglas Chandor. He is the same artist who portrayed Franklin Roosevelt the presidential portrait being on view at the National Portrait Gallery. Mrs. Roosevelt never liked having her portrait done, so it's a rare portrait. And to see Gwendolyn Brooks looking at it is, you know, she's enjoying being a tourist too. But what's interesting in the lower right corner is an autographed stage bill from that lecture that she gave here in our own Kennedy Center. And she's inscribed it to a young woman from the National Endowment who was with her that day, who is Black, and she inscribed it to her. And if I may read it, it's dated May 5th, 1994, for Kelly, with pride, underscored, and exclamation point. Keep your dream, hold on, exclamation point, Gwendolyn Brooks. So I think this embodies her passion for encouraging young people. Not only young people, she was an extremely kind person. In fact, she said kindness was her religion. If she met a writer or a student and they needed money for a meal, a car payment, or rent, she was there to help others. So if we go to the next slide, we can see how she was also honored with a US stamp in 2012. It was a photograph, I think, taken in 1983. She's smiling, she's got the big round glasses, and she was one of 10 American poets to be featured in that particular stamp collection. On the right side, we see a fairly current bronze sculpture of Gwendolyn Brooks with her glasses. She's got her left arm held up by her right, and her hand is touching her face. And this was created by a Chicago sculptor, McMahon, and it was unveiled in 2018 in a park that was named for Gwendolyn Brooks a few years before that. And in the background, just in front of the trees and on the grass, you see something in wood, and that's meant to replicate that back porch that Gwendolyn Brooks had used to do her early writing. So I thought we'd end the segment with Gwendolyn Brooks with the next slide. This is a very rare and unique opportunity. If we can go back, thank you, Jonas, to that, to listen to Gwendolyn Brooks being interviewed by Marc Pachter in 1996. And I'm hoping this will work because it's a wonderful way to hear how she felt about the bust that's at the Portrait Gallery. I think Jonas is trying to set it up. Here we go.
And the last thing I'd like to ask you, because you said you have it with you, is ending with poetry. You started in that young girl's voice. In your voice, I believe you wrote a poem about the bust, or the...
Yes, a tribute to the sculptor who is here. Would you stand up for Sarah Miller? I forget just which door it is, but you will find my bust, my head, standing there, sitting there.
It's right there beside you.
Where? For goodness sake. I came in here and didn't even notice.
There it is. There it is. I
love it. Sarah, I'm sorry to say that so many people are telling me they don't think that looks like me, but I do. I see myself in there. I think I can express that through this. Sarah, thank you for extending my life, for sending my life into bronze and beyond bronze as a clean pride not to be tamed, not corralled. You see beyond seeables, see beyond flesh, beyond motion, images, beyond the hard burnings. No longer walking through rooms, I shall be gone and not gone. And I really feel that way. I felt better about I felt better about leaving here. That's the truth. Ever since that was created.
So it's hard to follow that. But I always like, after talking about an individual, some little fun things that we might not think about them. One of the things Gwendolyn Brooks loved was soap operas. She loved watching soap operas. And if you think about it, that's what she was living and writing about, soap operas. But her daughter said it was hysterical. She would, her mother would give her a grocery list. And she said it was almost like a poem. She said, now, if you're going to buy tomatoes, look for bright, pearlescent, ruby tomatoes. So she was very down to earth. I think she would be somebody we would all enjoy meeting. So let's move on, if we may, to Henry George. Henry George is coming to us from the 19th century. He lived 1839, 1897. And he was called by many the people's champion and a philosopher and friend of the poor. Here we have two portraits of him. The one on the left is a very small one. It's basically a sketch. It's no more than like 10 by 12, even with the frame. It's painted in 1888. It is on view at the National Portrait Gallery and painted by George DeForest Brush. And I have to say, I always chuckle when I say his name because he's appropriately named for an artist. He did the portrait on the right as well, and he painted it twice, in 1895 and again in 1903. In the first picture, we see him in 1888. He's standing, it's a three-quarter pose. His left arm is akimbo. He's wearing a jacket, a tie. He's somewhat balding, but he has a lovely reddish beard and mustache, and he's gazing at us. In the other picture, it is a much larger, it's about 4 feet by 5 feet. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we see him seated in a chair with his right arm over the back. It's like a barrel chair with a wooden frame. And his left hand is in his lap holding a pair of glasses, and his left leg is crossed over his right. He still has that same lack of hair on the top of his head and the same wonderful beard. But we see in the background a very small picture on the wall. Both pictures are done in earth tones. So that's a description of the portraits. The reason Brush had to redo the 1895 portrait on the right is that something happened to the pigments. I don't know if they discolored, but the person who commissioned it, August Lewis, who was a friend of the sitter, asked the artist to do it again. We do know for this particular portrait, the one at the Metropolitan, that Brush had done several studies. He had a study of Henry George sitting at a desk, sitting in a chair with a book in his lap, or just sitting generally, and he did one of his feet and legs. So he did take a little more time that we know of. The Lewises gave this portrait to the Metropolitan. The smaller picture, I came into the Portrait Gallery collection in 1967. It was purchased from an art gallery that I believe represented the Brush family after he died in 1941. He had a very long life from the 1850s into the 20th century. So I from what I've read in his daughter's biography of him, this particular sketch was something that they kept in their home, and they would take it out periodically to go on view when there were exhibits of her father's work. So Brush himself said of the Lewis, the large Lewis portrait, you know, it's a good portrait, but it's not my usual style. So if we, oh, and one other thing about the chair, the family, the artist's family always referred to that as the Henry George chair, because the artist used it many, many times in his later works, which were devoted frequently to his family and several children. So if we go to the next screen, you'll get a sense of other kinds of style of painting that Brush had. That is his self-portrait in the top left. It's just his face. It's his full head of hair, bright, defined eyebrows, his ears. He's clean shaven with one of the old-fashioned standing white collars and a little bit of black there. He was very prominent in his day, considered one of the highest paid painters. He had a very good education, art background from the time he was a child. Then he went to New York, studied at the National Academy of Design, where he learned to do excellent anatomical drawings, as you can see in the painting below. But he also went to France for several years, and he started with Jean-Léon Gérôme, French painter, and so influenced and impressed by Gérôme that Brush named his son after him, Jérôme de Forest Brush. When he came back from Europe, he and his brother went out west, lived with several Indian tribes, and Brush made some sketches, eventually came back east, and started doing illustrations for magazines and doing paintings as well. He treasured the culture, the arts of the Indians. And so here, this is probably one of his most famous Indian paintings. It's an Aztec with a mallet inscribing something into beautiful, probably Italian marble. I mean, it's interesting that, and you see Aztec figures, musicians carved already into the right. So he gave that up. He was very sad to see what was happening, but he did, he was so impressed with Indian culture that he built a teepee in New York with his family and decorated it with a poster of Henry George. So he knew Henry George before he painted him. He later went on to move to Dublin, New Hampshire, where there was an art colony, and got to know many famous people there, like Mark Twain and others. So he's fascinating in himself. But let's get back to Henry George. If we can move on to the next slide, we have some photographs, 4 of them, that show Henry George at different stages of his life. In the top left, we see him as a young boy. He was born in Philadelphia. In this picture, it was done in 1852. He's about 13, and he's just getting ready to board a ship to travel around the world twice. He went to India, Australia, and he loved life on the ship. But he'd also learned to be a typesetter. His family were printers. So in the middle of one of the voyages, he decides, I'm going to stay in California. It's about 1858, looks like a nice happening place. And so we see him in the second picture on the left, where he's in a coat and tie. He's now got a beard and a goatee, beautiful, beautiful hair, wavy. This is 1865, so he's been in California a few years already, but he's now married and has 2 children. He decided, he was hoping, after he didn't do very well as a gold miner, that he would like to go back into newspaper, into journalism, writing. And he found that he couldn't always make a living at that. In fact, he was so destitute when he had, at that time, 4 children, he was begging on the street. That's how dire things were. but he was very interested in what was going on in the world. He'd seen everything. He'd seen how San Francisco had grown from a tent city to a metropolitan. And so in the photograph in the middle, here we see him in 1879, the year he published this very important work called Progress and Poverty. He was concerned about how modernization was affecting the American society. So here we see him in that book. And if you, at that time, and if you compare that picture, this is only what, 10 or 15 years after the young man with the bright eyes. I almost have a sense that he's been worn down by going in and out of poverty, all the challenges that he had. The last picture on the right side, we see him looking down. He's sitting in a high back chair. He's reading a newspaper. He's wearing his glasses, and he's aged quite a bit. He's aged quite a bit. But let's see what it was that made him so famous. And if we go to the next screen, we'll see his book, Progress and Poverty. There are 6 different jacket covers. The one in the center with a plain background was one of the originals from 1881. The question that Henry George was raising is why, amidst all this material and technological progress, was poverty increasing? What was going on with the distribution of wealth? And why was he concerned? He was concerned because he thought this disparity in wealth would undermine a democratic society. And he thought a lot about this question. And while he was not trained in school to any great extent, he was an avid reader. He used libraries. He studied different philosophers. He examined different cultures, and he talks about ancient cultures as well. And he's looking to see why did these societies not survive? And it was because of this disparity in wealth. And he said, well, I think I've got a solution. The wealthy people all own land. The workers can't afford it. Land is finite. It can't replicate itself. So it seems to him that everybody should own land. Land should not be owned by individuals. And the way to do that was to levy a tax, so it's also known as the single tax movement. So these were pretty radical ideas, and he had a hard time getting a publisher. So he self-published, setting the type himself. He printed 500 copies, and then he tried to get a New York publisher, Appleton, to take it on. And Appleton, well, you know, these kinds of books don't sell, but here's the deal. The major expense of printing a book, publishing a book, is getting it typeset. And so the deal was Henry George would typeset the book, and then Appleton would print it. And who better to do it than a man who already had experience as a typesetter? So it was a book that George was passionate about. It took him 19 months to write. He actually was poor. He had to pawn things to be able to continue his writing. But his writing reminds me of Thomas Paine in Common Sense. It was direct. It was like common sense. It could appeal to the common man. So I think the publisher may have been surprised and delighted when this book became not only a national bestseller, but an international bestseller. Millions of copies were sold, translated into multiple languages, Asia and Europe. It was serialized in newspapers. The only other book that outsold it at that time was the Bible. So it was, and continues to be, in print. In fact, the different covers, you see a very colorful image on the left, Progress and Poverty, with him in profile, and we'll see that image again. You see above it a British publication, or the Dutton Company, looking very Art Nouveau. In the center above the original, we see the the figure, the I on the dollar bill. And on the right side, two more contemporary with photographs of big cities where you see the slums and the wealth of the high rises in the back. So if we go to the next slide, in 1880, Henry George and his family decided to move to New York. And this is an era, just to give you a frame of reference. Between 1880 and 1900, there were 37,000 labor strikes. That averages out, if my math is somewhat correct, at least 4 strikes a day. So there's a lot of violence, a lot of unrest, unhappiness in the labor field. And so the Labor Party prevails upon Henry George to run for mayor of New York in 1886. So we see him in a little sketch at the top where he's standing on a high raised platform with others, and we see the crowd surrounding him and the sign saying, George for mayor. An injury to one is, I'm sorry, I can't read it all. But anyway, he's politicking. So what is the platform on which he's running? Well, obviously, land taxes. That single tax, we need to get wealth redistributed. He also thought that railroads and telegraphs should be publicly owned so that nobody could have a monopoly. He also thought, and this surprised me, that to be on a jury back then in New York, you had to own property. You know, that was a requirement in the early days of the United States to vote. States required ownership. But that sort of disappeared in the Jacksonian era. So that was unusual to see. And then, of course, for laborers, they wanted to work in a better place, work less, and get more money. And then the other two things are kind of intriguing. He's seeking equal pay for equal work for women in public jobs. Well, this is 1886 in New York. Many years earlier, the District of Columbia there was a federal law that did the very same thing. So here he's trying to get that for women in New York. And then the last one I think is particularly interesting in today's time. It is to end police interference with peaceful assemblies. While George did not win the election, he came in a very close second runner-up, but he certainly got a huge amount of votes, well beyond those received by the third person running, Theodore Roosevelt. So he runs again for mayor in 1897, and that's the little poster on the top right. And you see, it says what Henry George will do as mayor of Greater New York. And then you see a rooster. Well, the rooster is interesting because that became the symbol, ultimate later, for the Democratic Party. And it talks about the democracy of Thomas Jefferson. And under it, the rooster, it says, put your X in the circle under the rooster. So maybe for people who couldn't read, this was a helpful way to know how to vote. But sadly, he died on the eve of that election. He was a very famous person. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see how that got portrayed. He was often depicted in cartoons. Here we have him drawn as St. George trying to slay the dragon of landlordism. He's representing justice and free trade. On the right side, we see the image that was similar to the one on a book cover. It's H&M Company's Henry George. What are they doing? They're selling cigars. This is an endorsement. And they've gotten his permission to use this image. And while he's in profile with his gray beard and a jacket and tie, on the right in the curlicue design, you see Progress and Poverty, the book being noted, and then the rooster and the flag to denote the Labor Party. So he was pretty famous. In fact, people at the time said, other than Mark Twain and Thomas Edison, Henry George was the most famous person of the day. So who were some of these people who ascribed, and we'll see this in the next slide, who were the Georgists? Well, these are just a few. And you can see how diverse. We've got world leaders like Winston Churchill, former President Rutherford B. Hayes, labor people like Samuel Gompers, Ida B. Wells, the Black suffragist who was a journalist writing about lynching, George Bernard Shaw, Leo Tolstoy, William Buckley Jr., Upton Sinclair. I mean, the range of opinions that he would appeal to someone as conservative as William Buckley and someone as progressive as Upton Sinclair, Louis Brandeis, Clarence Darrow, Henry Ford. That sticks out. Emma Lazarus, the poet who wrote the poem at the Statue of Liberty. Frank Lloyd Wright, an architect, and then had to include George DeForest Brush, the painter who had done the portraits of Henry George. So it was, for Brush, that was a personal commitment. So if we go to the next slide, here, front page news, the column that Henry George is dead. He was stricken with a stroke. The campaign, the political campaign, has to figure out, well, who's going to take his place? Well, Henry George Jr. took on that role. He himself eventually became a member of the House of Representatives here in Washington. But I think this quote in the center under the headline captures the essence of why this man and his writings are significant. And this is his quote. He says, "Material progress does not merely fail to relieve poverty, it actually produces it. This association of progress with poverty is the great enigma of our times. It is the riddle that the Sphinx of fate puts to our civilization, and which not to answer is to be destroyed." So his death was a huge shock. And as we see in the next slide, a portrayal of his funeral, there is the catafalque being taken by the horses. This is a nighttime scene. We can see street lights. The streets are crowded with mostly men, but you see some women and their police with their you see bowler hats and top hats, and it's a huge crowd. And there are tall buildings surrounding. This is along Madison Avenue, and the interiors are illuminated. So people are probably watching from inside the buildings as this cortege makes its way from New York to Brooklyn, where he's buried. And it was the largest turnout for a funeral other than Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. So 300,000 people showed up. And I put a little quote here from Albert Einstein about Henry George, where he said, "One cannot imagine a more beautiful combination of intellectual keenness, artistic form, and fervent love of justice. Every line is written as if for our generation." And we still, as you can see, his writings are still significant, discussed, and debated. Labor Day came about because of him. He helped to lay the groundwork for the progressive movement in the early 20th century. New cities were actually created. There's one in Delaware called Arden, not far from Wilmington, based on the single tax that land cannot be owned. And one of its residents was someone we're hearing a lot about these days. Joe Biden lived in a Georgian community. So he did have a major impact. And I think one of the things he was trying to highlight is that in the 19th century, labor was devalued as industrialization came about. And perhaps we can say that today as well, especially the pandemic is highlighting that to some extent with the technological revolution. So I think he's still a pertinent figure. So if we go on to the next screen, another thing that Henry George influenced is one of his followers created a board game. Here is a color version in September 1924 called the Landlord's game. But Lizzie Phillips, who created this, actually, the original was done in 1904 and she got a patent for it. Well, I don't know if anyone can guess what this actually became. This is the precursor to Monopoly, the board game. So when you're playing Monopoly, you're actually playing according to Henry George's thinking, his philosophy. And some of the streets are interesting. One is the Loop. You've got Fifth Avenue. Of course, you've got George Street. And I love Lord Blueblood's estate. So you've got the railroads, you've got go to jail. It's very much the same kind of concept. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing to show his impact. And so if we go to the last slide, I think this also says a lot. Here we have a cartoon drawing of three figures, well, two people. You've got Leo Tolstoy in the center with his long beard and his tunic and high boots. He's looking at a figure with a long white beard wearing a jacket with stars and pants with stripes, probably Uncle Sam. And he's holding a document of some sort with names on it. And Tolstoy is gesturing to the third object, which is a bust of Henry George. And Tolstoy is saying to Uncle Sam, "Sir, this marble bust commemorates the greatest American of the 19th century." And who did Uncle Sam have on his list? Abraham Lincoln, Sumner, Grant, Garfield, Emerson, and Lowell. But Tolstoy was so taken with Henry George and the philosophy behind progress and poverty that in one of his novels, he has a character who's going off to Siberia. And what does that character take with him? What does he put under his arm? Poverty and progress. So a couple of little anecdotes. Henry George had another significant influence in American culture. He introduced the Australian secret ballot. Here, he'd been involved in an election, and New York back then was certainly very corrupt. And ballots were not secret. People, when you went to vote, people knew who you were voting for. And so he thought, maybe we can get rid of some of this corruption and people will just file this printed ballot. Well, all well and good, and it seemed to make a difference. But unfortunately, an unintended consequence was that in the South, which didn't want blacks to vote, they used it as a literacy test. So that was something that Henry George influenced too. And then the artist, I said he was fascinating, George DeForest Rush. He taught art for a while, and one of his students was a future First Lady of the United States, Ellen Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's first wife. She was a quite talented artist. Rush and another artist, Abbott Thayer, developed camouflage. They got a patent for camouflage. And Rush's wife helped to demonstrate that because she was a pilot. She herself had several patents for things that she invented. So very colorful people. So in closing, I just wanted to share some of my impressions to bring together these two extraordinary people, Gwendolyn Brooks and Henry George. She was a loner. She was surrounded by a close but limited community. He was mission-driven to explore the world beyond. She was inspired and encouraged by family and community. He was inspired by external events. They were both observers. She was checking out her neighborhood. He was checking out the whole world. She explored the inner world. He was interested in the external. They both experienced poverty and financial challenges. They had strong family ties. I think they shared a sense of adventure. Their experiences informed their observations. They used their words to inform and change the world. They both sought to promote equality. She with gentle, direct personal interactions, he with political and social change on a world stage. I think their words have challenged us to see both the obvious and the hidden and unseen. and their works continue to inspire and stimulate us. So that's all I have to say, and now I'm hoping to hear from you all. So thank you for listening, and Jonas, what do we do next?
Well, thank you very much for that. That was great, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. So the next step before we wrap up is questions, either on the paintings as a whole, really anything you feel like asking. You can, like I mentioned at the beginning, post them in chat by clicking on the chat button at the bottom, and I will read them off. Or you can use the raising hand function, and then I will call on you. And again, you do that by clicking on participants at the bottom, and then the raise hand button on the bottom right. So in no particular order, anyone that feels like asking a question can post it or raise their hand, and I will call on them.
While we're waiting, I can tell you, I think I shared this with Jackie, that, you know, we have a lot of people at the National Portrait Gallery. They're all interesting. But these are two people I think you'd really like to have as friends. I mean, they just seem like nice folks and interesting. So.
Nadia, you have to unmute too before you can. There we go.
I just wanted to give you a thumbs up. I thought it was really well put together, and it was an interesting contrast. I would never have put these two people together, but the more you describe them, the more threads they had in common. So I think that was really quite interesting. Thank you, Lorna.
You're very welcome.
Marc has a question.
Yes, sir.
There's a comment just to say, I'm actually very tempted now to read the Henry George book. He is mentioned certainly in my economics education, but kind of only in passing, and in one very specific sense, like I see it in the context even when they saw Milton Friedman is up there. And it doesn't even, I'm not even sure it's 100% right now, given what you're saying about his views, but the one thing we were always taught about Henry George was that he taught the idea that taxes should be based on land. But it was done from the argument about what can you control the supply of? The argument was, if you tax labor, people will withdraw their labor. They'll labor less. If you tax capital, people will invest less. But if you tax land, it's always there. It may be bought, it may be sold, it may be moved. There will not be more of it, and there will not be less of it. But even that doesn't quite hold up, because you know that if you go to Amsterdam, those very narrow houses in Amsterdam, that's because they taxed land. And so you could pay a lot less taxes if you made your house very tall and small, because they taxed the land area. So even that, it wasn't quite true that you didn't somewhat control the supply in that sense. But that's all I knew about him from economics education.
He's fascinating. I haven't read the whole book, but the bits I've read, you know, he goes back and he looks at other civilizations, other societies. He's not looking just at the United States. And he did have a huge impact in Britain, Ireland, and the British Parliament, very much influenced by his thinking.
Great.
Yeah. Adele, do you have
May I ask a question about Henry George? He was seen as something of an outlier, of course. I'm surprised. I mean, I was interested in you say how much support he actually had. What impact do you think he had on Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives? Were he and Roosevelt actually in communication about some of these ideas?
I don't know for sure, Adele. That's a good question. I know they were on the same, they were different parties in that election in 1886. From what I remember about Roosevelt, you know, he was a trust buster. He would, in that sense, George, I think, did not believe in monopolies and wanted to avoid that happening. And so it may be in that sense, but that's a good question. I haven't explored that, but that might be interesting.
I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with the art part of it. I'm sorry. I just was interested if he had chosen him. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's, I can't even remember now when I first started talking about him. you may have noticed the first slide said how words matter.
Mhm.
And that was something that intrigued me early on when Trump was elected. And I grew up,
Even those words?
that words make a difference, whether it's a tweet or a treatise.
Okay.
My mother always used to tell us, you know, it's not what you say, but how you say it. You know, if you want people to listen to you, you need to say, put your language in a different way. And I think through Gwendolyn Brooks, she had such great empathy, and she identified, I mean, her poems are full of emotion, and they're very pictorial, they're musical, they're stunning. And I've never read any of them, but they just grab your heart.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderfully done, really.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yes, Jane, is that you? From San Francisco? Okay, the land of Henry George. I can't hear you, Jane. Yeah.
Are there any other questions anyone has?
I think Jane Selby had one, but she's muted.
There you go.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, all I wanted to say was I really enjoyed this talk. I didn't know really anything about either of these people, and I find them very interesting. It makes me want to read more about them. So yeah, I learned a lot. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. Well, you know, does anyone, it's not that long ago we had the Wall Street Occupy. You know, we were talking about the 1%ers. You know,
Yeah.
That's Henry George.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
So, but yes, Jackie.
I just want to thank you, Lorna, very, very much for the great start to our new series. I hope other people can join us. We have 3 already coming up. Check the director's notes. We'll be sending them out to all other villages, notices. But thank you very much.
Yeah. And
A star is always, Lorna.
but you know, can I say something? And I'm sure this is true of us all. If you're passionate about something, the enthusiasm comes across. So I'm happy to share. Hi,
Yeah.
Judy. Yes. I can't hear you. You have to unmute, Judy.
Okay. That both of them are so relevant to today. It's like, you know, we should be reading Henry George and having our leaders read Henry George, and Gwendolyn Brooks is still talking about the kids who are jazzing June and dying soon, and that's what makes them great. They've lasted and still speak to people. Of course, it would be better if some of the situations they were talking about had been solved by now, but maybe tomorrow.
That's what's fascinating about history. And the Portrait Gallery does such a wonderful job of showing history through individuals. Some we remember, some we've never heard of, some we do. So. And for those of you, may I ask for people on the phone, were you able to enjoy it with just the visual description? Anyone want to comment on that?
I think we're down to just one person on the phones. Hopefully people got the full effect.
Okay.
But I do want to thank everyone for joining us on this first of our Art Thursday series. And the link will go out shortly for the next event in a couple weeks. But you can find more information on our website on all the events. And we hope to see you again. But I think we all owe Lorna a big thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, Lorna.
Thank you for coming, and come see us again.
Yeah.
Do.
Bye.
Bye, Lorna. Bye.